Hello, good morning, students. Welcome to the next session. I, Dr. Ghazala Bhoji, Associate Professor from GM Moment Women's College. Today, we will be dealing with a very important topic, that is intellectual property rights. Now, what and why is it important to study it in correlation with environment? Now, it is a well recognized fact that the conventional forms of economic and social development are proving to be inadequate in developing countries. Worldwide, there is recognition that the most important asset for a community, company, or a country are the intellectual capital and not the physical capital. It is very important for new innovations to happen in proper ethics, which does help the community gain. So it is important to have social ethics involved in any kind of development, in any kind of innovation. So the intellectual capital plays a very important role or is a very important asset. It is necessary to understand the evolution of knowledge, innovation, and practices which has happened over ages or era. These complex knowledge systems have evolved within socio-cultural and institutional contexts. Now, post-globalization, these knowledge systems which have been accumulated, gathered by the innovative spirit of our ancestors are facing threat or invisibility and extinction. Conservation of the environment, which definitely includes biodiversity as well as the knowledge system. This requires culture, institution, and technological innovation other than deep rooted ethical value set. A conservation ethic cannot be reinforced solely through material incentives. What is required, what is needed, what is necessary is that communities create and maintain the space and decide what to conserve, for how long to conserve, at what cost, and definitely for whom. And we do need to look into the drawbacks too. The challenge of consumerism, which puts pressure on the natural resources, cannot be counteracted only through cultural and spiritual value. The material needs for survival can put undue pressure on limited resources, like we did or when we spoke about the overexploitation of the environment with to make few profits. This needs to be resolved through putting up a portfolio of incentives for conservation and for use of environmentally friendly technologies and institutional arrangements. Now, what is intellectual property right? Why are we speaking about the IPR? There is a close relation between technology, institution, and culture, with each dimension playing an important role. In order to understand these relations, there is a need to understand the role of various incentives, including the ones offered by intellectual property rights regime. The technology provides the means to change the production, functions or ratios of inputs to outputs. The institution provides the rules, norms, values, which could be the choice of inputs to be transformed may be decided, the means of transformation, the scale of exploitation, and the various ways that social existence is achieved. The incentives for technological change and innovation must be built on the lines of sustainable consumption. A specific culture and historical context all have to be taken into consideration. It cannot be denied that innovations are necessary for improving technical efficiency of any task, as it reduces hard labor and is more profitable. As we know, when we move from industrial traditional handlooms to power looms, it does reduce hard work and does make more manufacture more clothes, leading to more profits. But we have to note, technological change on its own cannot ensure positive environmental outcome, especially in the absence of sustainable institutions and compassionate culture. The IPR regime are driven essentially by the rich developed nations whose companies hold majority of the world's patents. Property rights generally excludes other from the commercial use of protected knowledge for a given period of time. The rights does not allow for the use of that knowledge. It could be spoken as a small copyright. Such a right will be determined by other laws of the land, such as laws related to food and drugs, administration, pollution, etc. Conventional intellectual property law emerged out of the model of innovation over a period of time in history. Therefore, it does not fit well into many systems as it is difficult to trace the origins of traditional knowledge. Organizations, WTO, Trade Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, TRIPS, ideally should serve the interest of both rich as well as poor countries. But it is severely lacking when it comes to extending promised benefits to the developing countries. The developing countries have two major concerns. One, access to medicines, that is public health. The other, protection of resources, that is the environment, sustainable development, and traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge. Throughout history, natural capital. Now, what is natural capital? Natural capital is the world's stock of natural resources, which includes geology, soil, air, water, and all living organisms, has acted as the engine or the main source for economic progress. Natural capital can be guided by social capital, that is, the network of relationship among people who live and work in a particular society, enabling that society to function effectively. Some of which is also called as ethical capital, capital being used ethically, where the poor as well as developing countries are benefited. Social capital in the context of IPR can be understood as community-based institutional arrangement which help in the conservation and reproduction of natural capital. The essential feature of such capital is trust and reciprocity. Ethical capital can be understood as investments and institutional arrangements that may be governed by ethical norm. These norms comprises, what does the ethical norm comprises of? Accountability, transparency, reciprocity, fair play in terms of both human and non-human beings. The intersection of such ethical and social capital is possible only when common property institutions follow ethical value. Intellectual capital is understood as knowledge about natural capital as well as other kinds of technological and social interaction. What in which earlier we said that intellectual capital is very important for a country's development. So what is it? It is using our natural resources, our natural capital in a sustainable way, and other kinds of technology which will lead to profitable communication and use for the other people in the community. Intellectual capital comprises of literature, database, folklore, and other forms and informal sources of knowledge and wisdom. Part of intellectual capital constitutes intellectual property from which the knowledge producer can exclude others from commercial exploitation for a given period of time. Now we move to contested knowledge domains. Many knowledge systems in developing countries are based upon conservation of environment and biodiversity resources. A community creates its own conservation ethics and sustains it not only with material incentives but also with spiritual, cultural, institutional, and technological innovation. Now, these spiritual, cultural, institutional are the core of any society, and which does include in development which will be happening because of technological innovation. In context of contested knowledge domain, it is very important to understand the concept valorization. Now, what is valorization? It means adding value to a particular thing or concept. One of the major objections of to providing incentives to conservation is that valorizing a resource may increase the possibility of over exploitation of that resource, like giving value to a particular thing existing in an environment or in a social context will lead to over exploitation of that particular thing or that particular substance. Several traditional conservatists are cautious of any scheme which will add value to local resources. By value addition, local communities will find it lucrative and attractive to extract resources at a higher rate, endangering the resources base itself. Conservatives believe that valorization can go hand in hand with better norms of conservation as communities will appreciate the local term benefits of such exercises. However, they refuse to recognize the possibility that communities, with the help of local knowledge as well as public spirited scientists, may develop efficient and sustainable technologies which require lesser dependence on raw resources. Sometimes resource exploitation can be a result of a failure of institutional guideline and framework. Let us take the example of Taxol. Taxol was identified by the US National Cancer Institution to be an important means to developing anti-cancer treatment. As a result, the national cooperation in India began excessive harvesting and extraction of the bark of this tree. Later on, one of the major Ayurvedic company that exported this bark and its extract to USA started extracting the relevant component from leaves when almost all the old trees have been harvesting in Shivalik foothill in the North India. This is an example of valorization leading to unsustainable and excessive use of the resource. This example reflects not so much a problem of technology or valorization of the resource, but the failure of the institution. Therefore, it can be concluded that it is not just the incentive, but also the institutional context in which the incentive is provided that makes a lot of difference as far as environmental impact is concerned. We move to the other thing, that is overlapping domains of knowledge. Emergent knowledge could be a result of individual or group community effort. Some of this knowledge may spread only locally, characterizing it as a community knowledge, while other forms of knowledge may spread across communities, regions, and countries and become public domain knowledge. Sometimes individuals may share the knowledge within their own community as well as to those outside their community, making it a public domain knowledge. On the other hand, some knowledge may be produced by individuals who keep it confidential and restrict their access. Individuals may build their expertise by observation, experimentation, innovation based on traditional knowledge sources. In this case, individuals owe some acknowledgement to their community for the opportunity to make individual innovation. The communities hold the right to decide the conditions under which individuals may or may not be able to share their expertise or other knowledge with outsiders or even with other members within their own community. Now, this can be highlighted with an example. Every society has different traditions and mechanisms to protect their intellectual property rights. Now, if we look into the example of North Gujarat, the Pathan region, there is an old tradition of textile production, popularly known as Pathan silk. This region has only three families who are involved in this tradition involving use of natural vegetable dyes. The family guards their trade secrets so secretively that they keep it away from the knowledge of their daughter also, with the vision that they will be getting married and moving to some other family, and they might relieve the secret or they might give in the secrets of how it is made. This secret is only shared by their daughter-in-law. This tradition is only shared by their daughter-in-law. We could take another example is that of a community in northern Bengal which had the tradition of making an offering of a famous variety of mangoes to the king. The community often punctured the seed of these mangoes with a thin needle so that no one could grow these mangoes without their permission. Now, what does this reveal? That there are several communities, that there are taboos that imply that once a remedy is revealed, they have a belief that the value of that particular thing will be lost. Now, all these examples show that the concept of drawing a boundary around the use of knowledge and resources, including biological resources, is not a new one. Now, protecting intellectual property rights. Scholars have observed that the present intellectual property instruments are of limited help in regard to protecting traditional knowledge systems for the benefits of local communities. But they argue that with sufficient modification, these instruments may help to provide incentives and not disincentives for individuals and communities to share their valuable knowledge in the public domain. One of the challenges before policymakers is to plan out a portfolio of incentives which will provide monetary as well as non-monetary benefits to individuals and groups that are working towards conservation of diversity and associate knowledge system. Protecting intellectual property rights. There is an urgent need where we speak about poor communities. There is an urgent need to protect the IPRs of poor countries. The philosophy that drives the organization is based on 7 E's: efficiency, equity, excellence, environment, ethics, education, and yes, of course, the most important, empathy. It is worth mentioning that the IP instruments are only one of the many possible incentives for dealing with material and individual rewards. These of their own are necessary but not sufficient for generating environmentally friendly outcomes. Most IP instruments focus on efficiency, where the role of technology and IP instruments in providing incentives for innovation can be emphasized, and what are taken as secondary, that is equity, excellence, environment, ethics, education, empathy, these all are taken as or given as secondary importance. We need to realize, and it is important, that all the seven E's needs to be synergized and needs to be converged for the optimum impact. The intellectual property instruments plays an important but has potential limits and roles. There is a fear that an overemphasis on economic development will lead to destruction of the environment. But simultaneously, it has to be recognized that the motto of conservation should go hand in hand with addressing issues relating to poverty and welfare of community, which is also spoken by the MDG and the SDG goal. There should be mechanism at national level which will help correct the current distortion in incentive structures for local communities, or else it is feared there will be a steady erosion of knowledge resource which will be difficult to control in the near future. There is a need to create new models for protecting intellectual capital. These models should be in tune with cultural, spiritual, and ethical traditions of developing countries, especially to the norms relating to conservation of environment and biodiversity resources, which form the basis of their knowledge system. While global patent regime should not be opposed, it could be used as one of the potential way of rewarding innovation. The model should be modified to cater to the traditions and needs of developing countries. The global patent regime should also work towards an approach to generate material and non-material incentives for individuals and community for conservation. What do we conclude, or the conclusion? It is now recognized that the problems of developing countries will not be solved within the confines of laboratory of European or Western nation. The innovators will have to work alone and through the mediation of European network laboratories and incubation centers. It is pointless to put undue emphasis on just technology transfer rather than local green technology development. The future lies in harnessing of thousands of examples of innovation, practices, and knowledge system of local community. The entrepreneurial spirit of local community should be augmented by public and private sector research and development to work towards self-reliance. The few references which you all can explore and add more to your knowledge. Thank you all. See you in the next video.